welcome to my part of the meetup, where I'm going to talk about the rollout of OKRs. And I thought about it before. It's not really a session for beginners. It's probably more a session for advanced people, so who have read a lot about OKRs, who understand the concept behind OKRs, and who just asking themselves, how can I now finally kick it off? So what do I need to do for that? And therefore, I'm going to present you a toolbox in the form of a roadmap, what you can see over here. So you can see the metaphor with Super Mario. And I do also have 8 stages. And today I will cover, firstly, a high-level view of these 8 stages, and then we'll go into detail for the first 2 stages. So before we jump right into it, one more sentence about myself. So what is my background? I'm Ricco. I'm from Vienna. I studied medical informatics at the Technical University of Vienna, and I worked as software developer for several years in a small company. And in parallel, I also founded my own startup. It was in the running business, so a competition platform with several thousand users. And these 2 things were the base for my agile understanding, for my agile know-how, and also for my agile mindset, I guess. And this I brought into consultancy, what I'm doing now for the last 6 to 7 years, where I'm doing agile transformations, agile leadership coaching, as well as OKR rollouts. And sometimes I'm also speaking about my experiences on conferences and meetups. And as I just said, this session is more about let's say, advanced topics, but still I want to give a possible bridge for the people who don't know OKRs at all. So I will have 2 slides on my understanding of OKRs as well as the concept behind. So I always like to start with the definition of OKRs. So for me, one of the best definition comes from John Doerr himself, the one who introduced OKRs in Google, 1990. And he says it's a management methodology that helps to ensure that the company focuses efforts on the same important issues throughout the organization. That's one definition. I think it's quite good already. In my own words, I always say it's an agile strategy execution concept or an agile goal setting framework, but it's also not for sure something new. So OKRs are already here for the last 40 years, and they're just arriving in Europe, I would say, for the last 10 years now. And that's the reason why, we're going to talk about it today too. And in addition, let's have a small look also into the core idea. So not just the definition. So the core idea behind OKRs is the following. So we do have 3 different layers. We do have the first layer, which is the objective. So every organizational unit within an organization can have their objectives. So the objectives are saying, where do we want to go? So actually the target destination. Along this target destination, so if a team has like 2 to 4 objectives, we can also have key results. So we should also have key results because it's the KR in OKR. And they are telling us, how do we actually measure if we reach that objective? So what's the progress within our objective? At any point of time, we can ask ourselves, how much did we already achieve? And we should also ask ourselves that, so that we can derive the right actions out of it. So if there's no progress, let's derive the right action, and then let's get the right progress too. So we're measuring the value in here. And the third stage are initiatives. So what do we need to do to create this value? And this is actually the concept itself. So we do have objectives, we have key results, and it's a very lightweighted concept. So for that reason, there are a lot of people who are coming up with concepts, are coming up with frameworks, and coming up with different things, how to work with OKRs, because the idea is simple, but to master it, it's pretty difficult. And for that reason, I come always along with my own toolbox, with my own roadmap, and you can use it if you are a startup, you can use it if you're corporate. I would personally use not every step along this way, but the steps which are fitting for you. So let's start right into it. And I will firstly fly across the whole roadmap once in a very high level perspective. And then we will go into detail for the first two things. So I divided my whole concept, my whole rollout phase, my whole rollout model into three different parts. The first part is more about the initiation phase. So at any point of time, someone has probably a pain with the traditional strategy execution. So this pain most likely leads at any point of time to a trigger, which leads to the decision of the rollout of OKRs. And this trigger can be top down and bottom up. And I will speak more in detail about that in a minute. And if you have the decision, so the green bubble, then the next step would be that you need a specific concept how to roll out OKRs. So especially if you're corporate, so established OKRs in big corporates with 20,000 people, there you cannot do a big bang rollout for 20,000 people. This needs some kind of structure. If you're a small startup with 20 people, I would totally go for the big bang. If you're a bigger corporate, then let's do it iteratively. There are always questions also about why do we do OKRs? So I always like to have this OKR vision in place, which is also measurable in the end, and by introducing OKRs with OKRs. And regarding the setup, there are a lot of other questions like what roles, which skills do we need? Who is leading this transformation? Or also, do we do a vertical rollout or a horizontal rollout? And we'll also talk about that in more detail later on. And the outcome of this initiation phase is that the management then, or that let's say in a startup, the CEO or however you call it there, is announcing the OKRs, the rollout, so that you're going with OKRs. And then we come into the preparation phase. That means that we firstly need to gear up the leadership team, do an OKR training with them. This most likely takes, I most likely do it within 1 day. So with the global leadership team, for example, so that they really understand what is it about, how can they benefit from it, and how can they also explain it in their own words to their employees. After that, I always like to start with the leadership OKR drafting. So I normally do in a big corporates, just yearly OKRs, and on team level, then it's in a smaller cadence, like every 3 months or every 4 months. But on leadership level, I always like to have these yearly OKRs, and just if some kind of event is happening, like COVID in 2020, then you can also refine it with the help of quarterly OKRs on leadership level. So most likely leadership team has then, let's say 4 OKRs, so 4 objectives, which are measured by a different amount of key results. Then the next step would be that we are also educating, so that we are selecting and educating OKR coaches within a 2 days training. And afterwards, establishing an OKR coach community of practice so that they can exchange, so that the whole thing is sustainable. And having all these preparation steps, then we can finally start with the announcement of the objectives and the key results. So leadership team is most likely doing an all hands meeting, sharing their goals. And so the teams know, okay, now it's time for us to start our drafting. So teams, departments are going to draft. They're going to draft top-down OKRs as well as bottom-up OKRs. And afterwards, so this approach will take like 3 to 5 hours, depends if you do also have some kind of small training in it. And afterwards, there is the so-called OKR alignment. You can imagine if you have a lot of teams, you probably have similar goals, and you also want to use synergies. So therefore, representatives of the teams are joining this OKR alignment, which takes around 5 to 7 hours, most likely. And there you are aligning on the goals, you're teaming up, and you're also eliminating doubled goals, as well as probably leadership also needs to prioritize some goals higher than others. And then the first cycle starts. So that means that's the execution phase, where we do have like a 3 to 6 months cycles for the teams. I also like to have there in the beginning a retrospective within the coach community, and then a bi-weekly check-in. So if you're working with Scrum, for example, doing this check-in latest in the sprint review, we're checking how much progress is in our OKRs. Did we achieve what we wanted to achieve? And if you check your progress, you can also adjust your backlog. And if you adjust your backlog, then you're probably doing the right things first and you get the value you want to. After that, I also want to have OKR reviews, so inspecting and learning out of the objectives. And I also always have some kind of OKR playbook, what I'm maintaining in the background, so that the other departments, other teams are learning from each other. So that's for me a good practice. And then the next rollout stages are happening. So you can see in this big toolbox, there are a lot of steps. Some of them are for you probably not that necessary, but still, I'd like to use it as a first picture, because especially when you roll it out in bigger companies, you need the structure. If not, it becomes a mess. So therefore, let us have a look in more detail about the first step, which is what you can see here, the OKR trigger stage. So it's level 1 to come back to the Super Mario picture language, let's call it like that for the moment. So there we do have the question, who triggers the OKR rollout? And there we have two opportunities. The first one is top down, the other one is bottom up. Top down is for sure, I would say, more simple in the beginning because the decision is already there. We're going to use OKRs, management is deciding, but you still need the buy-in from the people. Bottom up, and it's probably, if you're not the CEO of your own company, more complex. There you need the right arguments. And for that reason, I would like to start with the second one, with the bottom-up approach. And that's the first stage within our OKR rollout roadmap. So, bottom-up, how to convince management from OKRs. I was also already in this seat when I was working in a bigger company with more than 2,000 people, that I wanted to use OKRs because I saw that traditional goal setting and traditional strategy execution is not working. And for that reason, I brought with me 5 different reasons how you can convince management from OKRs. That's for me the first stage to pull the trigger that management is convinced about it. Reason number 1 is we are all aware of the term VUCA, and still there are strategies which are made by the few without leveraging the whole system. And as we all know, a complex world requires a more distributed and decentralized decision-making process. And I would use here the help of the swarm intelligence, because come on, we are all knowledge workers. So why should just a handful of people decide what the strategy is? So it doesn't make sense. So that's the first argument for OKRs and against traditional strategy execution. Second would be that strategies are just words. So I've read through a lot of strategy papers and they are great, but they are not specific, they're not measurable, and it's really not clear when a strategy has been implemented and whether it was the right idea in the first place. So therefore, I also, to make this even more visible, ask in every workshop and in every training I gave, how many of you do know the strategy of your company? And that's not more in average than 5% of the people who are raising their hands. So what is the sense of having a strategy when people do not know what the strategy is? Because who will execute it? Is it the top management or is it at the team level? So that's my second argument. Third argument is, it's also, let's say, build up on the second one, the disconnection of strategy and execution. Therefore, I do have a little story. I once advised a company with 120 people, and they approached me and said, Ricco, we want to roll out OKRs. And I said, great, how far are you? They told me, yeah, we do have a strategy document. It's about 14 pages long. And I said, great. What does the people, what does the team think about it? And they just told me, so CIO and CEO told me they're not allowed to see it. And I was just questioning everything. And they still not rolled out OKRs, by the way. But it's not working if you're not having strategy and execution connected. So that's the third argument, that you need to have all on the same boat. And strategic level is still not integrated into the execution level in most of the organizations. Fourth argument is we do have within our traditional strategy execution no learnings through measurements. So often we have no measurements in place. Often we are measuring how many story points have we achieved. We're measuring how many projects have we completed. We're measuring how many things have we put on done. And this is just measuring output, as you know. This is not measuring value. And as long as we're not measuring value, as long as we don't have the right metrics to measure value, we cannot derive learnings and we cannot derive the right actions. So we need to know, are we on the right track or not? And that's also where OKRs are helping us. And the last argument, what you can bring towards your management to convince them about OKRs are that strategy cycles are too slow. So as we all know, strategy cycles are like for the next 2 to 5 years. And think about again, 2020, management set up a strategy in January for the next 2 to 3 years. Boom, COVID hit us. So no sense at all at having just these long strategy cycles. For sure, it makes sense to have a strategy behind the OKRs on leadership level, but still we need something more agile, which can react in a better way. So for that reason, as a short summary, what you can take with you out of this session is, instead of having strategies that are made by the few, OKRs are using the swarm intelligence. So strategies are made by the swarm. Instead of having strategies are just words, let's go for strategies are clear and measurable, for measurable goals. Instead of having the huge disconnect, let's have a connection of strategy and execution. Instead of having no learnings through measurements or the wrong learnings, let's have learnings through regular measurements of value. And the last one is, again, strategy cycles are too slow. Let's go with shorter strategy cycles with the help of OKRs. So I hope you take these reasons to convince your team lead, your CEO, however your structure within your companies, that you probably can convince them of using OKRs if you're a huge fan of it and if you think it makes sense. So this would be the bottom-up approach to pull the trigger. Then I also brought a very short second level one, so 1.2, which is the top-down approach. And this is most likely more for, let's say, department leads or for the C-level or for the senior management. So I keep it very short because I think 1.1 is more common. So what advantages do people or teams get by using OKRs? On the one hand side, it's a more purpose-driven work. If I do know what puzzle I play within the big picture, then it's also a more purpose-driven work. If I can also set up my own goals and also contribute so to the overall strategy. As we know, OKRs are also limited in numbers. So I'm focusing on a set of 3 to 5 OKRs as a team for the upcoming 3 to 6 months. And this gives me also a focus instead of having 20 goals in parallel. Then we do also have a goal alignment across the teams, which connects the team better and which is also then a good synergy that teams are really working in the same direction. OKRs are all transparent across the whole company. So it's a huge transparency as well as a better communication through this working in cycles also on strategy level. We do have continuous learning because we also do have OKR retrospectives regularly and a higher engagement of the team. So this is somehow a one-pager how someone in the management can sell OKRs in the first place, but there's a lot more behind it. But just that you have an understanding how the two different views are looking like. So that's the first stage of my rollout roadmap. So that's often also something I, as an external one, need to do because it's also often more difficult that this internal view is also accepted and valued. So that's also something I often do. Then the second level is, as we know from our rollout roadmap, about this rollout workshop series. So about creating the concept, what needs to be there in terms of structure. And I always like to use the OKR vision. So what should be changed by using OKRs? And therefore, in my opinion, an agreed OKR vision is also the key for a sustainable OKR rollout. Because if I have the management on board, if I do have a clear picture why we are doing it, then also the people will understand it better. And therefore, I'm using for this OKR vision a postcard from the future or several postcards from the future. And I'm also using here OKRs itself. So for me, this is the key elements of a good objective. So it has like a beneficiary. So who would you like to provide value to? So this could be the customer, this could be the employee, this could be the company itself. Then I do have a clear definition of the value. So what value would I like to provide to this beneficiary? And I do have a clear target picture in mind. So how should the future state look like? So why are we doing OKRs? And I brought also a small example with me. So within one company that said, we as a company have a clear connection of team and management objectives to increase our effectiveness. So we see there a clear beneficiary, it's the company. We see a target picture, which is having a clear connection of team and management objectives to have a better connection between these two layers, as well as a clear value, which is to increase our effectiveness. So this would be one of possible several postcards of the future, which is probably the target picture in 6, 9, 12 months of this whole rollout. And people will clearly understand why you're doing that. And that's just in one message. Secondly, I also would like to establish measurements to see if we achieve the promised value of our OKR vision. And therefore, I'm using 3 other key elements. Like I want to measure in results, not in tasks or milestones. I want to have it quantitative, so measurable and not binary. And I want to have a leading metric. So not KPIs, which I can measure afterwards. A leading metric is something I can measure along the way at every point in time. So not just like after a quarter, but tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, and so on. So that's, if you can achieve that, that would be the Champions League. And build on the example before, that could be, on the one hand side, 50% of the team objectives are connected to the leadership OKRs, or 100% of our teams use OKRs to prioritize their backlogs. So especially the second one is a leading metric. You can measure it at any point of time. You can ask the product owners, therefore, everything of these two is a result and also clearly quantitative. And as we can see over here, we just created our first OKR. The left-hand side is the objective. It's also the target picture we have for our OKR rollout. And on the right-hand side, it's how we're going to measure it. So especially the people who are leading this OKR rollout do have a huge interest towards the sponsor to show it. So as we just say, we just apply OKRs in our OKR vision. So we came up with the objective, we came up with 2 different key results. And the next step would be that the team who is driving this OKR rollout also comes up with initiatives. So that means with backlog items for their own backlog, with next steps, with to-dos, which are going to contribute to achieve the value of this OKR rollout. So this was step 2. And as we know, this rollout workshop series also has a lot of different aspects to cover. So in terms of the structure of the concept of how fast and where should we roll out OKRs actually. And as it says, it's a workshop series I'm often doing where we need to answer the following questions. And for sure, we'll not have enough time today or also now in the talk, but I want to give you some kind of understanding what kind of answers need to be, what kind of questions need to be answered first. And therefore, one example would be of the leading questions: can we do a big bang OKR rollout, or do we need an iterative approach? The second one would be which organizational units should be in which rollout iteration. Third one could be, should or could every unit within a company use OKRs? Fourth, what are the needed roles within an OKR rollout? Fifth, how do we educate the necessary skills? And sixth, what are the needed events within an OKR rollout? And if these questions are answered, then I would really kick it off, have the sessions with the leadership team, writing the first OKRs in the teams and in the leadership team, and doing all the events. And then you can really live OKRs. But especially in corporates, it's a little bit more complicated often. So we do have still, I guess, like 5 minutes of time. Is this right, Lukas? All right. Then let's have a short look into the different questions. So can we do a big bang OKR rollout, or do we need an iterative approach? I told you about the customer I had with 20,000 people. So there we don't had a big bang rollout. Also, if you have like 1,000 people, you don't have a big bang rollout. My rule of thumb is here, if you do have like more than 120 people where you want to roll out OKRs, if you have more than that, you should do it in an iterative approach. If you have less than that, you can do a big bang approach. So all at once. And if you do an iterative approach, I would like to show you probably one slide, like this. You can do it vertically. So you can go into Dept and go from management level down to team level. Probably there's also a department level, depends on your structure. And then extend at every rollout stage by 100, 200 people more, and go then from left to right. And that's highly recommended to use firstly the teams which have, on the one hand side, a good standing in the company, which is like a lighthouse, who acts like a lighthouse. And the other thing is I would use teams therefore as early adopters, which do have an agile mindset already. So for people who are not used to working increment and iteratively and in increments, it's kind of hard. But there could also be the idea of rolling out OKRs horizontally. So starting in the first two layers of your hierarchy. This often makes sense if there is a huge disconnect of the different departments and if you have a lot of silos. Then it makes sense to start with the rollout on the first two hierarchy levels and then extend it by another hierarchy level. So that would be the horizontal rollout. Just that you also have seen this once. And this also answers a little bit which organizational unit should be in which rollout iteration. So the more mature one in terms of agile, the ones who do have a good standing and which do also make afterwards as ambassadors advertisement for the OKR rollout. Then let me jump, because we're running out of a little bit of time, to the needed roles. So in my opinion, there are 3 necessary roles in terms of the within corporates. So I would like to see there an OKR sponsor. So in this 20,000 man company, it was the CIO who also brought the topic up. So it was a top-down trigger. And an OKR lead, so the one who is really leading the whole program, because it's a lot of effort and a lot of money going into that initiative. And then also OKR coaches or OKR masters, however you call it, which is around about 3% of the people who should have this skill. So it's not a full-time job, but who have this skill. So it can be an additional head for a Scrum Master or an Agile coach if there's still capacity, and who are then also facilitating the workshops and also sharing the knowledge when it comes to OKRs. And last but not least, let me go shortly to that question back again. So it brings me back to the roadmap. We are now within the initiation phase. And if you are in the execution phase, you will probably face some kind of event cycle. So you need some kind of rhythm, you need some kind of, let's say, ceremonies. So this rhythm always starts with the leadership OKR drafting and announcement. Afterwards, the teams have like 1 week time to do that drafting, to come up with their goals. The rule of thumb is to have here like 50% around top down, 50% bottom up OKRs. So 50% really connected to the strategy of the organization, 50% using the knowledge of the knowledge workers. And going then into the alignment meeting with the other teams, kicking the OKRs off, doing a retrospective, and then using this probably sprint reviews to do this bi-weekly check-in to see if you're really using OKRs, if they're really progressing, or if you're just standing still and need other initiatives. And then in the end, you also have a look into the OKRs, see how much you actually achieved, and then you try to learn out of it. And then the whole cycle starts over again. There is so much more behind it. So we can talk like 2 days about it. But just to show you how the journey would then continue. So the next I would like to talk about to you, if we would have time, would be how do we actually draft leadership yearly OKRs? So how is the workshop design actually? How do we enable OKR masters? So how does the training look like? How can we announce OKRs, and how do we facilitate team draftings? And how do we have, what are there out there great cheat sheets to write great OKRs? Yes, they are. And also on alignment, as well as on bringing them alive. And I'm sure Jenny will also talk about how to accelerate OKRs. So how can we really go the next step? So really looking forward to that. But if you have further questions, we will have a discussion afterwards. You can also add me on LinkedIn and ask question afterwards. I know this was a lot. I hope you can condense it. If not, yeah, let's have a chat afterwards. And I'm really looking forward now to Jenny's talk.
Wow. Wow, Ricco, thank you. That's really a lot to be fit. A lot was fit into 30 minutes. I had 2 people messaging me, being sorry that they cannot attend and asking if this will be recorded because it's quite unusual information, not something you typically simply find on the internet. So, Ricco, thank you a lot. And dear attendees, please start dropping down your questions in the chat as we will address them during our panel discussion in half an hour, just like Dragon dropped the question down there. And also, in the meantime, I do have a challenge for every participant. So I'm going to drop a question to all of you. And as we roll on into the second keynote speaker, think a little bit and try to answer, how would you explain what OKRs are to a 10-year-old child? So a little game to spice up our engagement. And now, our next speaker, an OKR orchestrator, the podcast host, and tech evangelist, Jenny Herald.
Thanks, Lucas. Thanks, Ricco. That was a really great presentation. So I'm going to go a little bit down level. So what Ricco covered was, how do you do this kind of from a systemic perspective? And we're going to talk about the individuals and teams that are responsible for actually drafting OKRs now. So taking it down a notch a bit. A little background on me. So I started, I guess, my professional career as an officer in the United States Air Force, and spent quite a bit of time working on really cool projects. Probably the most impressive, we want to call it that, was a project on intercontinental ballistic missile defense. And at some point in my career, I decided, you know what, maybe I leave the Department of Defense and work in tech. And so I pivoted my career 5 times now. And so my first was with Wunderlist. If you're familiar with the to-do list app, it was acquired by Microsoft years ago. Then I worked as the COO of Hubrick, which unfortunately, like many startup stories, it died, but because we just ran out of money. And then most recently, which I just finished up 5 years, helping formerly GTM Hub, now called Quantive, the rebrand. It's responsible for helping organizations roll out OKRs at scale as a B2B SaaS platform. So I just closed my 5-year chapter as of Monday last week, and now I'm kind of a free agent for a bit. So I'm able to talk to you about OKRs, I think, because I worked at a company that built OKR software, 1. 2, I had that podcast, 81 guests and counting. So if you check it out, you can find it on wherever podcasts are played. It's called Dreams with Deadlines. But welcome everyone. I think hopefully this will be a fun ride. Let's talk about what we're trying to do here with OKRs. Really, we're trying to enable everybody to do this thing that everybody's been talking about since forever, which is to be much more tied to data rather than chance or gut feel to assist in our decision making, right? That's what we want to effectively do. And I would suggest OKRs are kind of a new metamorphosis of that idea. In service of this, I hope, I mean, I'm talking to Agilists here, we build things, and what we want to build really is long-term relationships that add value to our users' lives and don't damage them. Many of us have probably read lots of stories about how products have been added to people's lives, but actually hurt them in some ways. Our intent, I hope, is that we don't hurt people in the process of what we do. And so with that as the backdrop, let's talk about OKRs and how that fits in the mix. I'll give my definition of OKRs and the difference between, let's say, OKRs and other frameworks like KPIs, because that often gets confused. So objectives and key results, my favorite definition came from Ben Lamort. He's the founder of OKRs.com. We spent many a session talking about his book, the OKR Field Book, which arguably is the best book you can read about how to do this in practice. And he says that OKRs are a critical thinking framework. And it's about a discipline that seeks to ensure that employees work together, focus their efforts to make measurable contributions. If I were to distill this into how I would say it in Jenny speak, ultimately, we want to understand the value and purpose of everyone's work. Like, that is the high level goal that we try to achieve with OKRs, is how can we ascribe value and purpose to everyone's work so it's clear. And so then the formula, which Ricco nodded to John Doerr, who arguably evangelized this at the onset, he learned this methodology from Andy Grove from his Intel days. And the idea is that we're going to do some objective as measured by a set of key results, which are those data points, those measures. And for product people or engineers or people who are in, our research departments or are doing, discovery work, all of us are thinking about this North Star metric. Like, if we were to connect this in the business context, every business leader is going to say, how do we increase revenue while also being efficient in our spend, right? How do we make money? How do we get profitable? In our product world, we want to be able to proxy that value that we are capturing, in some sort of way that we can actually affect change, the way that we can influence it. And that would be the North Star metric. And I won't go into too much detail, but if you're not familiar with that terminology, Amplitude has a wonderful playbook about it. And then in the mix between that metric and our OKRs is this product strategy, right? These are choices that we are making that say that we are going to create margin-enhancing, differentiated experiences in service of our customer. And then the objectives and key results are these point-in-time holistic metrics that tell us that we are moving in the right direction, that the strategy, the decisions and choices that we have made strategically are actually feasible in service of our overall mission, vision, and our value set, right? And so I like how Tim Harbig, if you're not familiar with him, follow his work. He is amazing. There's this universe of everyone talking about, well, we got to ship it. And a lot of our OKRs have a tendency to look very much like that, very outcome oriented. Like, the app is live. Here are the features that have been specified. We shipped them. We did tests for them. The world that we want to be able to evolve into is this outcome mentality, right? So what that the app is live? Let's say that in this case, you are creating learning software. You want to enable learning from anywhere, right? And you're doing it in a mobile environment, and you want to make sure that your customers are satisfied with that experience, and you're seeing an increase in the value that you're ascribing to that experience in terms of consumption of lessons, for example. And so you can see how we can shift our mindset just a bit and then find the spot where we can connect with business lever value, right? Because if people are using our app, presumably maybe we're charging for it. Even if we're not, the currency that we're trading here is usage in terms of Eyeballs or money. Like that's really the currency that we work with in product. Now, if we were to talk about KPIs, there really is no clear definition. I've not found. But they do tend to be measurements that tell us that our business processes, the way that we currently conduct our operations is healthy. In our product environment, we tend to talk about KPIs in a lot of different ways, but a few that kind of make sense to me are like, daily active users. Are we churning? Are our people satisfied with our product? NPS. Are people adopting the features that we're building? Do we see conversion happening? Like if there's a paywall, do we see them actually upsell, right? All of these things we are measuring to some degree in KPIs. And I think this is important to understand because when we work with OKRs, what we're really able to understand is how we currently exist as business operations today. And then how are we going to grow that stuff or introduce something new? And so being able to derive a distillation or a decomposition of KPIs into those driving factors is our trade space for how OKRs can work, right? So here's an example. We just talked about revenue, right? Revenue arguably is the number of transactions times the average transaction value, right? And then you can decompose the number of sales transactions to the number of clients and the number of average transactions per client. If you look at any business, it's likely that they have some sort of decomposition in this way. And if you talk to any given department within a team, they will tell you, oh, yeah, we can decompose customer service call time like this. We can decompose click-through rates like that. We can decompose NPS as thus. And in this decomposition, you find your trade space, I would argue, for key results, really good quality key results. Because what we're trying to do in the modern way that we operate in the world is we need to run the business and make sure it continues to exist and is existing healthily. Those are the KPIs. But we also have to change that business. And that is in the form of OKRs. And so they work in tandem together. And what leadership does is they define the destination and make sense of the series of choices strategically that the business should make. And as your teams are doing all their stuff, they're keeping an eye to make sure that things aren't going off the rails from existing business ops. And then we're using OKRs to elevate that, to grow it, to advance it, to add something net new. And then there's a bunch of work that happens to drive to those outcomes. And on a continuous basis, as you heard from Ricco, you're assessing and adapting that those hypotheses, those strategic choices still make sense. They might not. And that's why we call that pivoting. All right. The way that I think every team can start, and I argue should start when they're coming together to create OKRs, is to have a team charter of some kind, a mission statement, if you will. And so what is that? It is an action-oriented sentence that defines the value and purpose of your team, the strategic direction that you're going. It may be short-term in nature. Oftentimes, if you're talking about, let's say, a feature team that might come together, for example, maybe you have OKRs that are superset, that you exist to deliver some set of capabilities. Cool. And this is where you're defining those primary objectives. And you should create one, I think, because it helps focus the direction of that team. It guides your actions. It determines standards of accountability, and it provides a certain level of stability, right? We understand what's going on here. And if there is turnover, you have to renegotiate. Well, we used to exist to do this thing. What do we do now, right? It helps us snap into a new line if there is, changes that need to be made. In the most recent environment in tech, there's a lot of reorgs happening and a lot of layoffs. They're doing this renegotiating a lot. So how do you create a mission statement? My favorite way is to just kind of fill in the blanks here. We exist for this reason for this customer. That customer could be internal to the organization or external. We offer some offering, like this is what we do. And we do this in order to impact whatever. This is helpful so that we can be like, oh yeah, this is who we serve. This is what we offer. Maybe we're going to offer something new. But ultimately, it's like, this is the impact we want to have. This grounds us. And let me show you an example. So my most recent kind of big project was launching the Dreams with Deadlines community with Quantive. And we existed to empower all of these ambitious leaders, this community of them, to achieve their goals through all these practices we're talking about here. We had a series of offerings, and we did this so that we can foster long-term growth for the business, improve our brand awareness, and ultimately to solidify, codify loyalty for Quantive, right? This would be a differentiator if you were to pit us against another SaaS product out there that sold OKRs. Why would you continue with Quantive if you were an existing customer? Well, you find so much value in our community. Like, this is our thesis. And this became kind of a trade space where we can say, okay, given that this is kind of our long-term reason for being, how do we connect the dots in terms of decomposing what would be the local version of our objectives in relation to like the broader goal of the business, which is revenue. And so we can see a line of sight, as an example, between loyalty to Quantive is recurring revenue. Recurring revenue means we're able to renew contracts. Renewing contracts means whatever. And we can start to trace that back, right? So what makes a good OKR? I would say that you need to understand the components before you can even have an answer to that question. My favorite way to think about the universe is Kellogg's logic model, right? We have a bunch of resources, people, inputs, and we're doing a bunch of stuff in terms of activities. We create things, arguably those are the features that we're shipping, the capabilities that we're shipping, new products that we're shipping, to get some sort of outcome. And that's where OKR territory exists, so that we have some sort of impact to the business and to the customer. And that's where the revenue conversation, all of these things that are at the very root of that tree are impact, in my opinion. And the outcomes are derivatives of that. That's the decomposition. And then our outputs are like our roadmaps. And then further down the line, it could be activities being like, I don't know, name what Jira kind of story, whatever you want to call it. And then we can keep going, right? And again, then you can start to see, right, if we're going to do something as measured by some stuff, really, we want that to be number 4 as much as we can, right? Those are the intended results. And so before you even get into defining your objective, you should be asking yourself, what is our focus right now? And how are we going to measure that progress in this near term, whether it's a cadence of 3 to 4 months, half a year? And why are we going to want to focus on that? And why now? Because if you're doing this now, that means you might not be doing something else, right? And so a good way to think about whether or not your objective is good, and I really love Mukam's definition of this. I hosted an OKR Tear Down clinic with him a few times for the Dreams of Deadlines community. And he said, make sure that your objective is aligned to something. Ideally, the mission, the problem, the opportunity, the strategy, not your boss's OKRs. That's a bad way to align. The second is to align to something where to ensure that it is qualitative in nature, right? No number, no explicit or implicit number is in it. So another way to put it is, do you have a high five worthy thing? If you were to tell someone else your objective, would they say, man, that's awesome? Would you be inspired by that? And does it have a number in it? And if it has a number in it, it's probably bad. Terms of key results, there's really 3 basics. The first is the metric. This is the most common. We need to go from X to Y, and X to Y could be up and to the right, or it could be below some threshold, or down and to the right. But it's moving a number, some directional. And the second is baseline. Oftentimes teams will ask me, but Jenny, we don't know what this could possibly be because we don't have it yet. And I'm like, cool, then why don't you set a baseline key result? You go from 0 to some number. And a good example is, we want to improve our customer satisfaction. I'm like, great. What's your current customer satisfaction metric? And they're like, we don't have one. I'm like, then go get one. And then next quarter, or whenever you get to a point where you're like, this is kind of big, we're seeing a trend. I'm like, awesome. That's your new X. And now you can move it to Y. You see, it starts to build upon itself. And then the last is the milestone, which use with caution. These are typically key results that have a binary outcome. You did or you didn't, but you still want to focus on an outcome. An example that Ben gave me was he was working with a client and they were like, hey, we want to, make sure that we have a permit to build this house over wherever. And I'm like, cool. So they had to break down basically the action plan. And they built up to this point where finally they were able to get that permit. Remember, though, that milestones should focus on the outcomes rather than the to-do list. A good example from talking to Metro Digital recently, because they asked me this question, I was like, well, okay, let's say that right now you're glowing blind because you don't understand what's happening on your website. You have no idea. You have no dashboarding, right? And he was like, yeah. It's like, well, then you can have a combination of milestone and baseline key results. He's like, well, explain more. And I was like, we know what's happening on our website is your objective. And then your key result could be, you have a dashboard that shows you what's happening. And then you can have key results that also speak to, this amount of people actually visit the page. This amount of people click on said button, and you can start breaking that down into activities that morph into something that's bigger. But now you see, everybody understands, like, we know what's going on with the website, and that's cool. Okay, anti-patterns. There are 3 that I want to cover very briefly. The first is Goodhart's Law. This is why you don't have one key result, by the way. This is why we ask, if you talk to any OKR expert or coach, they'll say have at least 2 key results. The first reason why is because of Goodhart's Law. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to become a good measure. And the reason why is because people will optimize for that regardless of what happens. It's just something that happens. If you tell people you're going to be measured on the number of nails made, they're going to make thousands of tiny nails. If it's based on weight, they're going to create a bunch of giant, heavy nails. In the same way, this actually is proven out in, let's say, customer call centers, where you might have customer agents that are being measured on the number of calls that they take and resolve. What they'll do is potentially not completely resolve that problem, so that that customer will have to come back again because they're being measured on the number of calls that they take. Not great. Okay, Campbell's Law. This is a really gnarly one, because the more that a metric counts for real decisions, the greater there is a pressure for corruption, and it distorts the situation that it's intended to monitor. And we see this happening in elections and all sorts of stuff, right? This happens. It's kind of human nature. It's terrible. And so how do you respond to this, Jenny? The answer is you create a set of key results where you have effect and counter effects. So what is the short-term benefit versus the long-term cost? What is the quantitative measure versus the qualitative measure? And a good example of that is, like, let's say, I don't know, you want to increase the velocity of shipping. And we actually did have this as a key result at one previous company that I worked at. Like, we were not shipping fast enough. We knew it. There was something wrong. Processes were kind of crazy. But we needed to counter that because, yeah, they could be shipping stuff, but they could be introducing all kinds of defects into the system. And so we can balance these together, right? There could be an internal metric versus an external metric. A good example of an internal key result that you can keep a hold of is like employee NPS, or the number of employees in a survey saying that they're close to burnout. Hopefully that doesn't happen. But you can be pushing people really hard and everyone's feeling awesome, but at the expense of what? And you need to be thinking about what that expense or that cost could be. And I offer some examples here, as you can see. And then the last law I'll go through is Parkinson's Law. Work expands to fill the time that you give it, basically. And so this is why Ricco was talking about constrain your cycles. You need to have some sort of format so that you achieve your goals within some period of time. And the reason why is because people will use up all that time. And so this is not to suggest that you need to do, 1 month OKR cycles. That's mental, right? Because you have to coordinate probably across teams. If you're really doing this well, you're doing cross-functional stuff. But typically like 3 to 4 months, you're checking in and saying, do we want to keep this key result? Do we want to adjust this key result? Do we need a net new key result? Like these, they should change, but they shouldn't be so dramatic. And I think a lot of people who are coming into the practice of OKRs imagine that they have to go net new every quarter. And the answer is no, don't do that. Like look at it and see if this is, something you start, stop, or you continue, right? And if you continue, do you move the post a bit further? And a lot of teams will do that until they are satisfied, at which point then you upgrade your OKRs into a KPI, because now it's literally a part of how you do business, which is how they play together. All right. How to get goals right? Be limited. If you can get 1 or 2 OKRs with a minimum of 2 to maybe 4 key results for each, you're in good shape. Those feedback loops, you want to be able to see the immediate impact and stay accountable to the goals that you set. A previous team asked me about this. The way to do that is to really protect this time for your teams. I call them sacred hours. Like it doesn't have to be specific hours. It's the idea that it's sacred stuff that you want to focus on continually so that you can achieve the results. And then we talked about the KPI driver trees. Think about how your OKR can be connected to some top-line business growth. This is where what we do on product in terms of offering our experiences, our services, really connect to the business. Like we want to make that connection to the degree that we are capable of seeing that happen. They should be easily understood. Like you heard Lucas's question or you saw it. Like, can you explain OKRs to a 10-year-old? Hopefully you answer that question. I haven't seen it. And if you were to explain your OKR, you should be able to also explain that to a 10-year-old as well, because you must imagine that other teams might be looking at your thing and being like, you know what, I can help you with that. Or, hey, maybe we're missing this. I understand what you're trying to achieve, but we're trying to achieve this thing. What if we kind of work together and we had a shared OKR? That could happen. But it can only happen if people understand what you're trying to achieve. And lastly, they should make you uncomfortable. If you're doing this right, they should make you slightly uncomfortable, but not impossible. Because remember, what we're trying to do is change the business. We're trying to improve it in some meaningful way. And the way that we do it is through the products and services that we provide to our users. And I'll leave you, I think this is close to the last slide. The ways that I think about doing this really is about, maintaining that high bar. I ask myself, I ask my teams, I hope you do too, like, how could we be a bit bolder? How can we make this slightly better? How can we make this OKR check-in even more productive? How can I make this doc or email about what I'm working on a bit crisper for the reader? How can I set that bar just a little bit higher? And I mean, when you do these things, what you effectively are doing are you're working on a high-performing team. And I really like working on high-performing teams. I hope you do too. And these are questions that you could be asking yourself as you're progressing in your work and working towards your OKRs. Like, what can we do better is basically what we're asking. Close to last. Key results. How do we know they're good? Are you talking about outcomes and impacts? Hopefully you are. If they are output or milestone oriented, they're okay. If they're tasks, these are not key results. Those are the worst. So think about those, the type of key results. And then the other, and this is where you get into either a motivating or demotivated state. How can you influence it? If you cannot, or even partially can, you're in bad state because you have the intent, but no means in order to change it. And so the degree in which teams are able to be successful is that they're able to understand the context in which they're given. They understand their remit. They have the responsibility to do it, and they can influence it. And so make sure that your key results are actually influenceable, if you will. And with that, we did it. We now understand how OKRs and KPIs work together. We understand that we should know why we exist, who we serve, and what we offer. And we understand, hopefully, what makes a good OKR and how we can prevent those anti-patterns from happening. And with that, remember, we're using all of this as of stuff to assist in the decisions that we're making. What should we do next, right? And all of that so that we can build that long-term relationship with our user and not hurt them. And I want to thank you for your time and attention today. Hopefully this was helpful. You can hit me up on LinkedIn, Jenny Herald. I am not as fancy as Ricco, so I do not have a QR code, but now I have learned I probably should create one. And I think we are ready for our Q&A time. Thanks.
Wow, great conclusion, Jenny. Thank you. Thank you. All right, 2 experts, 2 fruitful keynotes, different approaches, different presentations. Okay, so now, Ricco, Jenny, I would like to invite you to the virtual imaginary panel. Let's imagine we have a couch or something, like we're sitting in front of the audience, right? And while you're getting comfortable, taking your water, you know how it is, I would like to address all the people who are watching this live stream or watching a recording sometime in the future. We're playing the game right now, and the game was for the participants with the question of how would you explain what OKRs are to a 10-year-old child? So we have an answer from Dragon. And Dragon is saying that explanation to a 10-year-old could be that OKRs explain where you want to get to and how will you know when you got there. All right. Thank you, Dragon. Thank you for playing the game. Okay. Let's begin the keynote. And actually, I'll just kick it off by addressing the questions from participants that we had. Ricco had a head start to read up and prepare, I believe so. So Dragon was asking, actually, Ricco. Dragon was asking, what do you see as pros and cons of vertical and horizontal way of rolling OKRs?
That's a really good question. So when are we doing what is, I guess, the other phrasing of the question. And most likely, if you do have like a very diverse field of teams. So if you have like on the one hand side, you have very agile teams. On the other hand side, you probably have typical blue collar work where you do have more like standard processes and so on to follow. Then I would most likely go with a vertical approach so that you go into depth for one specific, let's say, department and teams that you can learn out of it because every company is special, and that you can then do the next rollout into the next teams, and you can also decide how should we differentiate probably for white collar, blue collar work, if there's something like that. And that's for me one of the main targets. So to understand the company better, if it's like not that diverse, let's say the teams are very old software development teams, probably one marketing team and so on. And there is more like silo thinking within the teams, then I would start with doing a horizontal rollout across the different hierarchy levels.
Yeah, I see Jenny nodding as well. All right. Jenny, do you feel like you also would like to add something to Ricco?
Yeah, I mean, so I tend to be a bit more or less prescriptive, I guess. It's not a question of vertical or horizontal in my mind, right? I prefer for any kind of process to be one, especially something like this, to be one that is more grassroots in nature. And so I like to work with a team or the teams that are already performing exceptionally well and roll out OKRs with them. And the reason why is because you can log wins pretty quickly. And when you log wins, you effectively have collateral that you can start marketing internally to say, hey, look at this team who was given a remit, to do OKRs. This is what they decided to work toward. Look at what they have achieved. And other teams are like, wait a second. They get more attention. They get more funding. They get called out during all hands. I want to do that. And then you end up with a more organic adoption of the methodology rather than one that some people I've heard say, man, it was like a mandate that came down from the bosses and I hate it. And now I have to comply with this whatever new thing of monitoring our performance. And that sucks, right? So But I'm coming from a very, I guess, startup privileged perspective where I get to make those kind of decisions even. So this is my take.
Okay. Thanks for your take, Jenny. And Jenny, there is actually also a question addressed, I believe, to you from Renata that I'm going to voice up, which is, what is the healthy amount, do you think, of yearly, quarterly objectives for 5 to 10 people agile team? What's your take on that?
A 5 to 10 person agile team. How many OKRs should they have? Okay. I'm going to go a little bit more on the Christina Wadke. There's a few schools of thought on this. Christina Wadke is probably the most severe, I think, and constraining. She wrote the book Radical Focus. She says 1. Right? We're going to have a lot of keep the lights on work to do as agile teams. And we also know that there's going to be, because we're agile, things that we did not anticipate having to do. And so if you can just do 1 OKR and focus on that, can you imagine what would happen if a 5 to 10 person team focused on 1 objective and a set of key results for some amount of time, whether it's 3, 6 months? They would do some pretty radically awesome stuff. And so it's kind of like the difference between a light bulb and a laser. They're both light, but a laser will cut through shit. Be the laser.
All right. 1. Dragon is with you on this, Jenny. Yeah.
Yeah. Plus, I mean, who has time to report on all that stuff anyway? We could report. All of us can report on 1 thing with 2 key results, and be like, wow, look at that.
Okay, Ricco?
It's an interesting question, and I would say it's complex in the end. So as Jenny said, it's about how much time do we invest into keeping the lights on. So if it's like already, I don't know, 90%, we don't have time for strategic things or something. So how does it make sense to use OKRs at all if I don't have time? So time is very crucial, as well as do you have moonshots as OKRs, so really ambitious goals, or is it like more the traditional Central European way, like in Germany and Austria, where it's like 100% is fine, but we don't want to aim higher. So for that reason, I think it's a mixture of that. But I would also go and recommend between maximum 2 to 3, because it doesn't make sense. As Jenny said, we'll monitor this all in the end and how it plays together. So that's really not to underestimate.
Yeah, I hope that's these several approaches will give some clarity on that. Paulus, one of our participants here, noticed that we mentioned that OKRs should be measurable anytime, not in quarters. Could you emphasize on that?
Yeah, I think it's also something Jenny talked about. Jenny, you talked about the decomposition from KPIs to key results and how to get a bunch of great key results possibly, because that's one of the things which is the most difficult one, in my opinion, to get measurable and great key results. And that's the thing companies are struggling the most in the first cycles. And then on top, I often differentiate between leading metrics and lagging metrics. Lagging metrics would mean that you can look after one OKR cycle into the past and you can see what you've achieved. And then you can measure, was it good or not? This makes it automatically a binary key result. So that means during the cycle, it's always a 0, and in the end, it's possibly a 1. So better would it be if you have something like a leading metric, which you can measure in best case at any point of time, in worst case still regularly, like on a weekly or worst case monthly basis, to also see, did I make progress or not? And I know this is especially difficult when it comes to surveys, because this is the last hope everyone has when it comes to OKRs, which are related to employees. Let's do a survey. That's the first everybody will mention. And that means that you have, on the one hand side, a lot of surveys, but then on the other hand side, you cannot do this every day. So I think leading metrics are great. If you just have it like in a monthly way, it's still great. If you have it on a quarterly way, then it's more like looking into the past, like a typical KPI, and not really getting most out of the OKRs.
Thanks, Ricco. Jenny, Ricco, you both had a chance to listen to each other's keynotes as the time went. And I'm just really interested having you both very experts with deep knowledge in that. Jenny, was there something in particular that caught your attention during Ricco's presentation that either highly resonated with you or maybe you felt like disagreeing a little bit? That would be super cool to know.
I wish I had like the whole presentation to think through because it was quite dense. That's a good thing. I'll say that a lot of the things that I had seen Ricco mention, like again, I've talked to hundreds of OKR experts at this point on my podcast and interviewed, so it's really hard to surprise me anymore in the realm of OKRs. But what I will say is I did like, you had mentioned who is responsible for the program, and you mentioned like 3 different archetypes. I think that's really cool. And I appreciated the kind of the roadmap that you provided for the cadence. But I've seen variations on that. It was neat to see a different take. The one thing that was new to me was this horizontal and vertical, because most people don't tend to emphasize that. What I've heard is people say, you might want to roll this out to a department, or you might roll this out like on a cross-functional basis. I think Ricco's the only person I've ever heard say, if you are siloed, do cross-functional OKRs. Like, I think you might be the first to boldly say that, because most practitioners that I've heard suggest doing like maybe one adjacency if you're in that scenario. Because when you're going from 0 to 1, that is doable. Going 0 to 10 is not from the onset. And so, like, let's say, I don't know, you realize that the customer success team has a remit to manage upsell, cross-sell opportunities. Your sales team also has a very important role in that. Maybe product needs to get in the mix. Like, how do you even identify that is going to be a challenge. And I think that's why Ricco and a lot of people have a job, because they help organizations talk through the challenges of having to sort how do you go cross-functionally when you're highly siloed. So I think that was really nice that he touched on that, because that is, for many enterprises in particular, something that happens once you start to get a lot of specialization within the business. I don't think there's anything that I would necessarily rail against, though, because Ricco, unlike some other folks that I know, you tend to be more centrist. Maybe that's the European in you. Whereas like some of my more American counterparts that I've worked with as coaches are very opinionated and tend to be somewhat polarizing in that way. So.
Thanks, Jenny.
Yeah. Thanks, Jenny. Ricco, some question to you, though. What caught your interest in Jenny's keynote?
Different things. So as I said before, what I really liked is how you emphasized on the whole topic of KPIs and key results. So the decomposition, as well as also, as you talked about KPIs and having a look onto it like a health dashboard and so on, like how is the organization currently. Also the differentiation to the product KPIs. So I think this is also opening a lot of minds and good food for thoughts also for me. And especially for sure the good heart metric. So also with the nails, always a pleasure to see it, and you used it exactly in the right moment. And also then the different amount of metrics. And I think we had a lot of similarities in terms of content for sure. But as you said, you bring it up more from the startup and team perspective, what is great. And so we met somewhere in the middle, I guess. And
I think so.
That is really cool to see.
Yeah.
So nothing really to rail about. So if it comes to 1 to 2 goals, that's the only part where I've thought about it. When I think about a huge company, and I'm most likely here consulting sometimes 1 to 200 man companies, or up to, as I said, 20,000. If we do have leadership OKRs on the highest level, then I emphasize that it can go more into the more broaden it. So having like 3 to 4 objectives, so that if some teams need a North Star in terms of OKRs, they can have it. And if I just have 1 or 2, I think it's a little bit difficult, but that's just if you have, I guess, a huge corporate.
Cool, Ricco. Thank you. Guys, in your experience, what are the most common misconceptions the organization have about implementing OKRs, and how do you address them?
A lot of times I hear people adopt OKRs because they read a book and they're like, oh my God, especially if they read Measure What Matters. That seems to be the common story. Some CEO or some C-level read Measure What Matters. They come back to their team and they're like, we got to go do this. Let's do it now. And then everyone's like, what are you even talking about? And then the misconceptions are that this is going to fix a lot of the problems that, the book talks about, like misalignment, a gap in the strategy execution, all this stuff that Ricco was talking about. Like, this is not a panacea. This is not a silver bullet. If anything, especially in enterprises, I would say, it's going to highlight a lot of problems that your organization might have. And you're going to want to blame the method as not working. And it's not the method's fault. It's because your organization might have some sort of challenges that need to be dealt with as precursors or as prerequisites before you can even adopt something like this. The example that Ricco gave about, does your organization know the strategy? Most employees probably don't. And you kind of need that strategic context so that you can make better decisions for the business if you're setting goals toward it. Otherwise, everyone's coming up with their own idea of what the end strategy might be and are moving in a direction toward that. And so you might end up with greater misalignment as a result. So there's a lot of thought actually that comes ahead of any kind of OKR adoption. Does that mean, so that's the one case where you're trying to do this corporately. But that's not to say that a team can't adopt OKRs on their own and see benefits, because they can. And one of the challenges then is, once that starts to happen, somebody upstream will be like, wow, that team's performing really well. Now I want to do it for my whole team. And then you see organically how that might grow. So just take it with it. They are as useful as you make it and as dangerous as you make it. I guess that's my key message. Is you have to be very thoughtful about this, because you're asking people to focus energy and time on working towards some outcome. Is that the outcome that would be the right thing for the business? That becomes questionable if there's no negotiation internally about that.
Yeah, I believe that applies to many frameworks though. Ricco, any misconceptions you have faced?
Misconception is tricky. I think, Jenny, you had it on point. So OKRs are no silver bullet, and in the end, we need to understand the core problems, the core issues of organizations. It's the same like with the Spotify model and so on. Just to use any kind of concept, framework, or idea and think that it will work immediately. So we have to adjust and adapt also here. And the only thing what is often a discussion also in trainings or workshops is the thing about personal goals, how to connect personal goals and also compensations of salary and so on with OKR. So that's for me a clear no. So no bonus should be somehow connected to, or no bonus salary should be connected towards an OKR and so on. Why? Because in the end, then we're not working again together as a team. Then we're working again in silos and trying to firstly achieve our personal salary-based target and then coming back to the OKR. So that's a really tricky situation where you need to find out how do we, on the one hand side, have this bonus salaries, and on the other hand side, have these goals which should also work. And this shouldn't, go against each other.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Ricco. Guys, are the OKRs an ultimate silver bullet, or are there situations when we should not use them?
Oh, do not use OKRs for run the business stuff. Like, that's just dumb, in my opinion. That's where KPIs are for. The other is, it's not like a must, but Ricco mentioned it. I am not a big fan of individual OKRs because I think they tend to be more problematic than they're worth. And it adds additional overhead where the added benefit to the organization may not be realized. So I tend to tell people to avoid them altogether and opt for shared or team OKRs. So those are kind of the two. I don't know. Is there a third, Ricco, or fourth? Like, those are kind of the two that I think of.
I would just have one additional, and it's I wouldn't recommend OKRs as a silver bullet or at all. So I had one client I consult for the last, 4 to 5 years, and we did different things in different teams and so on. And at one point of time, it was the idea to roll out OKRs, and there they had the wrong mindset, in my opinion, from management perspective, to roll out OKRs in the organization. Why was that? They were too much into micromanagement. They were not really trusting the teams.
Good call.
Doesn't work.
Yeah, it doesn't work. Like, command and control structures are difficult to have OKRs work because they do require kind of a more bottom-up thing. Otherwise, use management by objectives, which is the old school version of that, where you actually tell people what they're focused on. And I guess there is another that came up to mind since I've worked in this startup scale up. If you're pre-product market fit, don't do this. Like, the whole point of OKRs is to grow. If you don't know what your levers are of growth yet, then you're adding additional overhead to a team that literally needs to just ship things and see if they work, and see if they can get traction. And once you get traction, you're like, man, we're pretty dang close to product market fit. Then you could put gasoline on it. Up until that point, you have no fire, so you're dead. Don't do it. This is me. So those would be the 4 things, I guess.
Agree.
Nice. That's quite a lot. Thank you. Okay, last question that comes from me, and one more question we will pick from the audience. So, question from me: what trends do you guys foresee in the evolution of OKRs or goal setting frameworks in the coming years?
So I don't have the lottery numbers right away, but I try to foresee the future. In my opinion, the next ultimate step would be, it's not for every company the next step, but for most of the companies, if they've established OKRs, most of the time it's like having OKRs around stable teams, what totally makes sense. But I also saw it already that there are that teams are created around OKRs for a specific amount of time, for 2 or 3 cycles, and then they're leaving each other again and coming up to other teams to work on goals. So I think this is quite an interesting take on how to work with OKRs in the future. So just around a goal, and as soon as the goal is reached, or enough is reached, to split up again. How we do it currently, it's like having teams, stable teams, what is great, and working with OKRs for a long amount of time.
Right.
Yeah, I'm bad at forecasting that sort of stuff. So I'm gonna go with Ricco's question, answer. Yeah, let's go with his. That's good.
Yeah, that's cool. That's great, guys. Okay, final question from Renata to wrap up the panel discussion and the whole meetup. And Renata is asking, what are the most common tools to manage and track OKRs in tech companies? Because it should be challenging for company top managers to overview how teams, employees are working with OKRs and how company is making a progress on the strategy implementation.
Okay, so the most common form, and if you read so I worked at Quantive, as I mentioned, they had a OKR trend report 2023. Only 10% of the organizations that were surveyed actually used dedicated OKR software. a majority of people use spreadsheets. And if you're only working with 1 to 2 OKRs per team, and depending on the size of the company, that might not be overwhelming. I can give you, so there is a really big company that starts with a G, and it's really, really, really big. And they have a thing that they made called Copilot, and they use spreadsheets.
Good old spreadsheets.
But there's also dedicated software. So if you want to look into that, there's all kinds. And you want OKR dedicated, you can go at Quantive. There's Workboard. There's Profit. If you want to go more HR directionally, then you will look at Lattice. If you want to go into more like, oh, this is terrible, like software dedicated for software people, then you're talking Jira Align, the Atlassian Suite, Atlas, stuff like that. So it depends on what you're trying to accomplish. If you're more of a safe house, like if you do scaled agile framework, then you're probably going to look at something like Atlassian Suite. So it really depends on what you're trying to solve for, and based on that definition set. But I'd say start with spreadsheets. Always process before product. Always process. Get OKRs working, and then think about what you actually need from a product to serve you. So that would be my advice.
Yeah, it's actually, Jenny, as you said, the last sentence. So for sure, first the process, and first getting things speed up, and having 2 or 3 cycles. And I was just saying, after the 3rd cycle, we can think about tooling and so on if it's really necessary. For sure, there's a lot of great tools where you can also do a lot of analysis. And yeah, but as you said, Jenny, it's sometimes too much in my opinion, and it's not that complicated as we made the world. If I would suggest one tool, I would go with WorkPath, because there are some close friends of mine there. But nevertheless, I think you can do it in the beginning, especially without a tool. If you have 20,000 man company, then you should probably have a chat how to organize yourself about that. But if you're smaller, do it on your own.
Ricco, Jenny, thanks a lot for being with us tonight. Thank you for letting us pick your brain and having presenting these amazing presentations that we will have available even after Meetup. And thank you for being with us